السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته.
عليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل أعوذ برب الفلق من شر ما خلق ومن شر غاسق إذا وقب ومن شر النفاثات في العقد ومن شر حاسد إذا حسد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل أعوذ برب الناس ملك الناس إله الناس من شر الوسواس الخناس الذي يوسوس في صدور الناس من الجنة والناس. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوات
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. First of all, may Allah bless all of you who are here this evening to listen. My preference would be that all of us have an opportunity to share in the kind of topic that we have in mind for this evening, which is simply to learn more, to find out more about America's history, because as some prominent people have said, and the Quran is very clear on this subject, and that is, if a person does not know his or her history, they cannot deal with their present, and obviously they cannot deal with their future. So knowing the history is critical for identity, for progress, for tackling the issues that we have to take on. And so before I make the brief comments that I have this evening, I'd like you to entertain a question. And this question is, how is it that a nation can redeem itself after it has committed gross crimes, indescribable crimes, atrocities? So I'll repeat that. How can a nation redeem itself? How can it heal? How can it recover when its record is mired with all of the things that I just said? This is an important question to entertain, because we know that in previous societies before us, there have been previous civilizations that have been destroyed, eliminated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for their crimes. And the Quran is very clear about that. For example, in the narrative of Bani Israel, they were distanced from Allah. Allah says, Lu'ina Bani Israel. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put a distance between himself and those people. Some would say curse. Our good friend, our good brother, deceased brother, Dr. Adnan, he used to describe the Latna as to be distant from Allah. Those of you who know Arabic probably know the meanings much better than I do. But I think the idea is consistent that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala detaches or cuts off his rahmah to such people for what they've done or what they're doing. So some scholars raise the question, is the annihilation or the disintegration of a people something relegated to the past? Or can it happen in the present? So then we can ask ourselves the question, are we living at a time when the gross violations that are surrounding us, what are the significance of these violations? These are questions that we have to ask ourselves. For example, the recent development of this legislation that tried to go through in Arizona regarding that community, the gay, as they call themselves, the gay, the lesbians, the transvestites, the bisexuals. They were hoping that they would get their legislation, or the legislation that was proposed, they wanted it to be reversed, which the governor vetoed that legislation. So we're living in a time now where we can clearly see that there's huge momentum in this area of this lifestyle for these people who are really shoving their lifestyle down the public's throat. And in the narrative of Nabi Lut alayhi salam, we see what happened to these people whose lifestyle, their private lifestyle and their public lifestyle, was a condemnation and a scourge on society. We're living around that, just as an example of many other things that are occurring. So it's very important that we know the history of the place that we're living in, such that we can understand the present that we're living in so we can go forward. I'm going to go back a little bit in history just to try to shed a little light on what we may want to think about. All of us know that the person who's called Christopher Columbus came to this part of the world in 1492. He never really landed foot in what we can say America proper today. He landed in Hispaniola, which is today Haiti and Dominican Republic. And he began his program of staking out the land, the territory, the people, such that he could return back to his financiers with the story that he had found this beautiful land, this beautiful place that was worthy of exploiting. So from the time of 1492 up to 1600, 100 years or so, this very precious and dear land with its very dear people, civilized people with a high culture, they were constantly being watched. There were, the term they use in the history books, which is very misleading, they say that this area was constantly besieged by explorers. And we know their names: Ponce de Leon, Amerigo Vespucci. These different people were supposedly exploring. And that's the term that they like to use, but it really wasn't exploring. They were doing reconnaissance, essentially, just staking out the territory, finding out the resources, looking at the people and seeing what they could obtain for their own financiers or whatever countries or whoever they were representing. So this carried on, and there are some reports that say, for example, from 1492 up to the year 1550, about a 58-year period, when Christopher Columbus arrived in Hispaniola, there were 250,000 Arawak Indians. 250,000. In less than 58 years, or 58 years or so, that number had been essentially demolished. They were victims of a genocide, a protracted genocide that effectively by 1600 they were completely gone. There were no Arawaks. And their killing, their slaughter, their demise, their genocide primarily came as a result of diseases that came from Europeans who were migrating here, and later on I'll say something about that in the 17th century, who migrated here with a hope and an aspiration of taking over the land. Of course, some of them would say that was not their intention, particularly when you take into consideration something they called a 30 Years' War, which occurred in the 17th century. In Europe, they had something called a 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, where people in Europe, Germany, Italy, and other countries were fighting. They were fighting among themselves for land, for territory. For example, they had a policy in some European countries that if you were in the military and you were fighting in a particular land, the occupants, the residents of those lands had to house you. You could take their property, you could take their resources, and you were virtually in control. You dominated those people at that time. So this and other factors had put Europe into a crisis where they were fighting and fighting, so much so that after all of this death and destruction had occurred there, many of them decided that they would come to what today we call the United States and take over the lands from the native peoples. Many of these people were what they refer to as skilled laborers. unskilled. They came here, they took over, and we know the story. Some historians say that the native peoples in this country, we call them the Native Americans, the Indians, were more enslaved than Africans. And one of the reasons why, when we discuss the subject of, or think about slavery in this country, which was brutal slavery, a type of slavery that the world had never seen, one of the things that initially happened to the Europeans who came to this country, they came as what we all know as indentured servants. They would come here, they didn't have the money to migrate from Europe, somebody would finance their trip. They would come here, they would have lodging, they would have food, they would have different things that were given to them by the landowners, the plantation owners, and they would work on these plantations for 4 to 7 years. And after working from 4 to 7 years, they could gain their freedom. And after gaining their freedom, they made demands. They said, we worked, we were indentured servants, we were honest, we were loyal, we did all of these things. Now we want some land. We want land, we want some freedom. So the plantation owners didn't like that. And they had to find a new population that they could exploit and bring them into a system that is really the system of American slavery towards African people in this country. They call it chattel slavery. So the people who had been using and exploiting indentured servants, they switched from them after their demands were too high and too nerve-wracking for these masters or owners, and shifted the scene to Africa. The first Africans who reportedly came to this country and were, they didn't call them enslaved initially, was in 1619. And many of us who go to Jamestown, that's a sad place, to go to Jamestown, Virginia. I don't know, I've been through Jamestown, I've never gone there like for a field trip or a visit. I don't know what spirit a person should carry if they go to Jamestown, because the first Africans they were actually sold. There was 20 Africans who were sold from a Dutch ship who landed in Jamestown at a port. And they were desperate, they were hungry, and they were out of supplies. And that docking place was a place of exchange. So they got food and supplies, and they left the 20 Africans behind in Jamestown. This was 1619. And they didn't call their status slavery. They kept them there. They worked them. Some of them eventually gained their freedoms. But in 1661, some 42 years after 1619, Virginia actually made laws to make slaves. Massachusetts in 1641, Virginia in 1661. And this is what they may call the beginning of slavery, which America had a system of slavery that they adopted that no one has ever seen. Slavery has been an institution around since the beginning of time, and it has had varying forms and varying faces. But slavery in the United States is unique. There has been no slavery on the planet like slavery in the United States. It's called chattel slavery. And chattel slavery is the type of slavery that the so-called master owns the slave, and the slave has no rights at all. And not only does the slave not have any rights, the children of the slaves, of the enslaved, remain enslaved. And the grandchildren remain enslaved. And there is no possible way to gain one's freedom under the system of chattel slavery. Slavery in other places had a range of possibilities. Somebody could be a slave, servant, and have acceptable treatment. Somebody could be enslaved, like in the Roman Empire, and subject to all of the brutality that we know about. There was a range, but the slavery in this country was called chattel slavery, the worst form of slavery ever seen. And the duration of the slavery was at least 246 years, from 1619 to 1865, which was even longer than 1865. This is what we're told. Some say 300 years, some say 400 years. These are the numbers that we hear. Malcolm X, in a book that he has when he's lecturing to younger people, he said that at least 300 African people died in the slave trade. 300 million over that period of slavery. Those enslaved, died in slavery, or en route to enslavement. 300 million, that's a huge number. And if you compare that number, it's more than numbers, it's life, to what the Jewish community puts forward about the Holocaust, and they tell us 6 million. And then you compare that to 300 million Africans. And we're talking about from North America to Argentina. We're not just talking about in the contiguous United States. We're talking about the Caribbean and going all the way down to South America. That's a huge number of people. And so today, we are living here in this country in the legacy, in the shadow, I should say in the nightmare of enslavement. A huge crime. How much blood, how many tears, how many heartaches, how much pain cannot be measured. And with this type of thinking, knowing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is just, it takes us to a point, it should take us to a thinking point, that if this type of thing happens, and it did happen, this type of criminal social behavior happened to innocent people, natives who were here at least 12,000 years before Europeans arrived, and then African people who were essentially kidnapped and brought here, then a question arises is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala oblivious to this history? Is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala leaving the resolution of these type of crimes to Yom al-Qiyamah? Is there any possibility that a nation that has committed this type of crime, these type of crimes, is there a possibility, as I said from the beginning, raising the question, can it be redeemed? Is reparations for people who were victims of something like this suitable? Reparations to the Chinese people in this country after internment in World War II, when they were arrested, 120,000 or so of them were put in concentration camps and kept, and not a single one of them was found guilty of spying or being a traitor. Not a single one. They lost their homes, their businesses, families destroyed, etc., etc. We know the story. We have to ask ourselves, where are we fitting in this big scheme of things? Now, there's an African proverb, and I'm paraphrasing. It says, the lion will never have his story told so long as the hunter is telling the story. Because the hunter always exaggerates the story. So the history that we're living with is an exaggerated history. We don't really have an accurate history of what actually has occurred, which requires us to dig through what has happened and be serious about it. Why? Because we are standing on the shoulders, or we are sinking in a kind of a cesspool of a history that has not left us. Some scientific discoveries today, some of the people who deal with human behavior are saying now that there's a genetic predisposition to behavioral mistreatment that's becoming intergenerational. Meaning someone who was a victim of something maybe 100 years ago, and now the grandchildren of that person who maybe didn't experience the violations or crimes, somehow the trauma of that experience is now in the genes of that person. And the genetic trauma, the trauma that's embedded itself in the genes is manifesting in the behavior. The social scientists, the human behaviorists, they're studying these things, and they're seeing that these things are playing out. And the statistics today if you look at people who were victims of enslavement, and I'm talking about poor whites, Africans, the Native Americans in this country are all but pretty much demolished. they're just living on the margins of life. We're all in the middle of this scene. Now, Thomas Jefferson, who was the third president in this country, he made a statement. He made many statements. He was a person who had 650 slaves in his lifetime as the third president in this country. 650 slaves, and he made a statement, which I have in my notes here, where, I'm paraphrasing, he said, I tremble when I think that my Lord or that the Lord is just. Because he was a person in deep conflict with himself. He would speak against enslavement, but he had slaves. He would write, he is the architect of the Declaration of Independence and all of what it says. And at the same time, he had enslaved blacks. So he himself is saying, I tremble when I think that the Lord is just. I have his exact statement, but for the sake of time, I'll just tell you the gist of it. So the thing that I'm trying to share with us this evening is that we really have a responsibility to become very familiar with the history of this country, because everything that's happening around us is a reflection of that history. We cannot delude ourselves to think that we're detached from the history. We're not. We're living in that history. Now, one of the things that Islam did on the subject of enslavement or slavery was Islam, from what I read, did not from the very beginning make a statement to say, for example, slavery was haram. Slavery was one of those institutions that Islam went to work on. The Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala went to work on it. Why? Because it had been an institution that had been around so long that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who's al-Hakim, so wise, he knew that this is something that could not be eradicated immediately, just like khamr. In the Quranic experience is not something where Allah immediately said, okay, stop drinking, it's over, it's done with. People had to grow out of it. So, but what the Quran did was it invited the practitioners of enslavement to step out of it. They could find ways that they could leave slavery and free themselves from the harm from it. And I found a few ayats. I'll share one ayat with you where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about how it dealt with the subject of enslavement. Yeah, that's the one that I really want. Yeah, this is an ayat in Surah An-Nisa. It says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. وَمَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ أَن يَقْتُلَ مُؤْمِنًا إِلَّا خَطَأً وَمَنْ قَتَلَ مُؤْمِنًا خَطَأً فَتَحْرِيرُ رَقَبَةٍ مُؤْمِنَةٍ وَدِيَةٌ مُسَلَّمَةٌ إِلَى أَهْلِهِ إِلَى أَن يُصَدَّقُوا. Here, Allah, and it goes further, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, it is not fitting, it is not appropriate for a mu'min to kill a mu'min unless it's done by mistake. If it's done, the killer, he who have killed a believer by mistake must set free a believing slave. Must set him free. So here, one of the things that Islam did was to discourage people from practicing slavery. Was there were certain things they could do in certain situations that would exonerate them from the sin. Freeing the slave, ransoming the slave. A person who was enslaved could buy his or her freedom by telling the master, say, look, I want out. I want to buy out. I'm going to raise the money. I want out. And Islam came and said, okay, you master, you must honor that. And so the Prophet ﷺ, when he used to teach about the subject, he used to say to those of you who have a slave/servant, you must feed him as you feed yourself. You must clothe him or her as you clothe yourself. You must honor him as you honor yourself. You should not give him a job or a task to do that's beyond his capacity. And if you do so, you must help him discharge it. So much so that the servants/slaves we might say the Muhammadi period, that even when they had an opportunity to be free, meaning to leave the presence of the one who was influencing them, or I don't like to use these terms, owning them and control of them, many of them they wouldn't want to leave because the treatment was so great they felt like a member of the family, so they wouldn't depart. And you know, there were many occasions where wealthy Muslims in the early days would buy a person who was enslaved so he could have his or her freedom. So Islam approached this subject of enslavement, going back to the question that I raised initially about how does a nation redeem itself. Islam put into practices and instructions everything we need for redemption. And so long as we're living in a society that has so many ills, that if we don't find a solution for redemption, then our status is very uncertain. We must, as a community, find a way to tackle the historical nightmares that are playing themselves out today in our lives. We see them all around. We may not be directly impacted by some of the things that are occurring. I mean, I could share a number of statistics about many things that will tell the story, but I think you all know how disastrous things are. And I'll end by finally saying there is a writer, his name is Amos, Dr. Amos Wilson. I think he's passed away. Somebody brought him to my attention. And he said, laws are not enough. Now he's speaking within the framework of the United States. He says, having laws, written laws is not enough. Because we've had written laws. The Constitution required an amendment for African people to vote in this country. It required an amendment for people to have citizenship. So if the Constitution, which is supposed to be the supreme law document in this country, required an amendment for people who were born and raised here to gain some freedom, and then those freedoms, even in those amendments, were not fully realized under what they call black codes from 1800 to 1866. And I think you all know what black codes were. Okay, black codes were codes they had in this country, particularly in the South, that would say, for example, it is not that a black person could not give testimony in a trial, that a black person could not be seen in a congregation. Like all of us here, say if all of us were African American, we could not meet unless one white person was with us in the room. Black codes about all the black codes essentially were racial discriminatory codes that were actually matters of law which preceded the Jim Crow era. So Jim Crow era, which were no other codes and laws which dehumanized African Americans, followed the black codes. And here again, we're living with all of these things today. But going back to Dr. Wilson, he said that it's not enough just to have laws. What's necessary is the enforcing of laws. Because there are a lot of laws on the books. There are laws, I mean, everybody's been affected by these laws, particularly those of us in this country, the Muslim community. They have one law for this and another law, and then all of these things change. One year it's this law, the next year the Supreme Court changed it, it's okay over here, because the mindset and the creators of these laws, they have no principle. The laws are not rooted in values, so they can change them according to their own whim. So what Dr. Wilson proffers is that if laws are to gain meaning, then you must have power. If you don't have power to enforce the laws are meaningless. for example, the Supreme Court decision 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, which was the law that desegregated schools. Okay, this was the law, but it still segregated schools. So what's the purpose of the law? So the law looks good, it's fine. That's one of the tricks here in this country. Here, a lot of the people who come here, and some of the people who live in here now, they say, you see, America is not like other places. It has laws. And then I remember one person, he said, you see, nobody should criticize the electoral process here, particularly presidential electoral process, because it goes off very smoothly. You see, it's never any upheaval. There is no coup d'etat. It just goes off so smoothly. And it's not like the Arab world. The Arab world, they come in and dictators come in and they take over, et cetera, et cetera. Somebody's, is viewing this type of smooth, as they might say, transition from power to power as something plausible. But it's not, because it doesn't we don't really see the results of a meaningful law. And as Malcolm X said in one of his debates that I saw, he was speaking to a panel who was questioning him. They were trying to corner him. And he told him, they asked him, they said, how come you're not a part of the civil rights movement? And he said, I'm not a part of the civil rights movement as such because it doesn't get any results. And he said, I challenge any of you to show me one result from the civil rights movement in the past 5 years, 10 years, or 100 years. He said that in 1961. They didn't challenge him. So we're living in a very difficult time where we really need to examine and know carefully the history that we're in, so that some of the machinations that are occurring in the world today around us, impacting us directly and indirectly, we would know more about. And I'll just say this: wouldn't it be nice, as an example, for example, so many of the younger people here, younger brothers here, to really take, like, Ukraine is unfolding in front of our eyes. What's the story? I just wrote down, I said, let me look and see what's the resources in Ukraine. Because, these people never, I told somebody, we have the good cop and the bad cop approach in America. When the cops want to get something from you, they send a good cop. And then if he can't get it, then they send a tough cop who tell you, I'm going to hit you in the mouth, I'm going to hit you in the head. But they both after the same thing. So the same with Russia and the United States. But here, look what their resources are. Ukraine. Because it has nothing to do, I'm sure, with humanity, dignity, preserving life, women, the children. Iron ore, Ukraine. Coal, manganese, natural gas, oil, salt, sulfur, graphite, titanium, magnesium, railing, nickel, mercury, timber, arable land, farmland. So how much money is that worth? Okay, and who's going to benefit from these resources over there? So here, it would be nice, you see, if we together, we should take these kind of issues on and really study them in depth, break them down, and particularly with the younger people here. Why? Because through this process, they will gain and have a methodology of how to approach these issues that are unfolding right before our eyes, and they'll know how to deal with them. So I'll end here. Thank you very much for listening. Sorry to give you something so detached, but even just thinking about the subject for the past few weeks has been overwhelming with so much going on. But thank you for listening. That's all.
اللهم صل على محمد